Good evening. This morning, Mike gave a very powerful lesson on the work of Hezekiah and his duty to restore Judah to faithfulness. We read how he cleansed the temple of all the evil idols, how he opened the doors again, restored the priests to their service, their faithful service to God. How he was teaching the people the laws of God so that they can restore their faithfulness to God, how they celebrated the Passover and even invited men of Israel, people of Israel, to come down. A great king, a good king, one who served God faithfully most of his life and dedicated his life to leading the people towards God. It's one of my favorite kings in the entire Bible. Hezekiah up there with Josiah for me. But sadly, most of Judah's kings did not follow in the steps of people like Hezekiah and Josiah or David. Despite being the faithful line of David, whom God promised many things through, sadly, many of those kings did not serve God as they ought to. We read of several kings who, throughout their entire leadership, entire rule, were wicked and terrible. When you read the beginning of a king's rule in the book of Chronicles or Kings, you kind of get a bit of a hint of where this king is going and how he's going to act. Either he's walking in the ways of the Lord all his life, or he's walking in the ways of the Lord most of his life. Or you read of many kings where it says they walk in the ways of Ahab, the worst king of Israel, or walk in the ways of Israel, or in the ways of Jeroboam, Judah's kings acting like Israel. But you have a few kings who start off well. They say they walked in the ways of the Lord. Some kings who even attempted to reform the people and bring them back to faithfulness, and yet down the road they fall. And great would be their fall. And they end up walking in the steps of those evil kings and even doing worse than those. And I think the most fitting person to that kind of description is King Joash. Joash, we read about him in 2 Chronicles 24. So if you would turn over there, we're going to be talking about him. Joash is a king who basically had everything going for him. He had a good education and being taught about the ways of the Lord. He had good mentorship to help him do what was right. And yet, by the end of his rule, by the end of his reign, he makes the problem worse instead of better. But in order to understand Joash, and before we even get into his story, we need to look at some context because Joash's background is a bit complicated. Joash is the son of another king, Ahaziah. Ahaziah is one of those kings that I talked about who is wicked throughout his entire rule. He walks in the ways of Ahab. He brings idolatry into Judah, and not just into Judah, he brings it into the temple of the Lord. And part of this style of leadership comes from an evil influence that's behind it, his mother. Reading in 2 Chronicles in verse 22, it says this in verse 1. Then the inhabitants of Jerusalem made Ahaziah, his youngest son, king in the place, because the troops had come with the Arabs to the camp that killed all the older sons. So Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, became king of Judah. Ahaziah was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Athaliah, granddaughter of Omri. He walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother gave him evil advice. So he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, like the house of Ahab, for they were his advisors after the death of his father to his destruction. So evil influences, evil mentors corrupt Ahaziah, and he leads the people astray to idolatry. He only lasts about 1 year on the throne before God takes him off, has him killed. But that doesn't end this drama here. Because Athaliah, the evil mother, the evil queen we might call her, to Ahaziah. After her son dies, she seizes control. She takes power, she becomes queen, and she sets out to kill everyone who would be a potential threat to her power. She kills all the possible heirs so that she can retain control, except for one, and that is Joash. At the end of 2 Chronicles 22, we read of this. In verse 10, it says, When Athaliah, Ahaziah's mother, saw that her son was dead, she proceeded to annihilate all of the royal heirs of the house of Judah. Jehoshabeth, the king's daughter, rescued Joash, son of Ahaziah, from the king's sons who were being killed, and put him and the one who nursed him in a bedroom. Now Jehoshabeth was the daughter of King Jehoram and the wife of the priest Jehoiada. Since she was Ahaziah's sister, she hid Joash from Athaliah so that she did not kill him. When Athaliah reigned over the land, he was hiding with them in God's temple 6 years. So the evil queen is going out killing all the heirs except Joash, who at this time is about 1 year old. He is saved by his aunt here, Jehoshabeth, and we read how she protects him as he gets older. She is married to Jehoiada, a priest who Reagan read about a few moments ago. Jehoiada is a faithful priest who sought to help lead the people spiritually. He saw what a terrible state Judah was in, and he sought to make things better. And they saved Joash to put him as king and to try and set into motion this reform. And in chapter 24, Joash takes the throne at 7 years old, a young king, but he has a great mentor, Jehoiada, this one faithful priest who desires to see change. And yet, despite everything Joash has going for him, despite having a good upbringing at the hands of one of the most faithful priests in the Bible, despite having that mentorship and that leadership, Joash falls short of the mark. And his fall is great, and I think we could learn a lot of lessons from that downfall. And this lesson is titled, How to Be a Loser. I kind of took this from Mike. He helped me out a bit with this. And the title really reflects on the character of Joash, how someone who had everything going for him, fell so far and so hard. And I want us to learn lessons from this. Take the warning that comes from Joash's life and how he lived, because I think many Christians can fall into the same steps that he did. And we're going to split this sermon up into two eras, I guess you could call it, of Joash's rule. You had the beginning when he was faithful. You have Joash as a reformer, and then you have Joash as a rebel or as a renegade when he falls short. Joash as a reformer was pretty good. He started off strong. Let's pick up in chapter 24 and verse 1. Joash was 7 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zibiah, and she was from Beersheba. Throughout the time of the priest Jehoiada, Joash did what was right in the Lord's sight. Jehoiada acquired 2 wives for him, and he was the father of sons and daughters. Afterward, Joash took it to heart to renovate the Lord's temple. So he gathered the priests and the Levites and said, Go out to the cities of Judah and collect silver from all of Israel to repair the temple of your God as needed year by year, and do it quickly. We'll stop right there. It says that in the entire life of Jehoiada, his mentor, his father figure, someone who basically adopted him and raised him, Joash was faithful to the Lord. He was doing right. And in his service of reforming Judah, he didn't have to start from scratch. Jehoiada, this priest that was so great, started the Reformation for Joash while he was still young. We read from what Reagan read in chapter 23, how Jehoiada went out and he got the people together and they renewed the covenant to the Lord. And they went to destroy the idols that were in the Lord's temple so that they could cleanse the temple and restore their faithfulness to God. And Joash is picking up from where Jehoiada left off, and he looks at the state of the temple. And although the idols are gone, the temple is still a wreck. It is still a mess from the effects of Athaliah and Ahaziah. So Joash has it in his heart to restore the temple, to fix it up. And so he has people go out and collect money in order to restore the temple, to make it after the requirements that God has it. And there's some hiccups with that, and he starts demanding this, and eventually the work gets started. We read at the end here, picking up in verse 13, the workmen did their work, and through them the repairs progressed. They restored God's temple to its specifications and reinforced it. And then when they finished, they presented the rest of the silver to the king and Jehoiada, who made articles for the Lord's temple with it, articles for ministry, for making burnt offerings, and ladles and articles of gold and silver. They regularly offered burnt offerings in the Lord's temple throughout Jehoiada's life. And so we see through Jehoiada's mentorship of Joash, Joash fixes up the temple. He makes it look good again. He repairs the damage that was done, but that's the extent of Joash's reformation, which I think shows the beginnings of his fall. The first sort of red flag we see with Joash is his reformation was focused on physical restoration of these things. Restoring the temple was a good thing, but Joash never addressed the issue at the heart of all of this, the heart of the people. Sure, he made the temple look good, but the hearts of the people were still set on idolatry. He never went to teach them the law, to restore their faithfulness like we read Hezekiah do, and we will read about Josiah doing. He's more focused on physical beautification of the temple. And he doesn't look at the heart of the issue, which is where real reformation comes from. Because as Mike quoted from Hosea, God demands mercy and not sacrifice. That God wants knowledge of him. This is what's most important to God, and Joash makes no effort to lead the people in that way. And so I think this is where Joash fails at his reformation. He's not looking at what God desires, which is faithfulness, but rather he is just focused on building up this great temple. He does good work in doing this, though. I don't want to take away from the fact that this was a good deed that he did, but this deed didn't last long. Neither did Joash's faithfulness. As you might have recognized, as we've been going through this story, we've read this repeating phrase in the life of Jehoiada. Throughout the life of Jehoiada, these things were done. That Joash was faithful through the life of Jehoiada, that sacrifices were offered through the life of Jehoiada. But Jehoiada did not stick around for all of Joash's rule. But picking up in this next section, it reads, Jehoiada died when he was old and full of days. He was 130 years old at his death. He was buried in the city of David with the kings because he had done what was good in Israel with respect to God and his temple. However, after Jehoiada died, the rulers of Judah came and paid homage to the king. Then the king listened to them, and they abandoned the temple of the Lord, the God of their ancestors, and served the Asherah poles and the idols. So there was wrath against Judah and Jerusalem for this guilt of theirs. Nevertheless, he sent them prophets to bring them back to the Lord, and they admonished them, but the people would not listen. Jehoiada, the man who raised Joash, who taught him the ways of the Lord, who mentored him to do the right thing, dies. And what happens after? There's a vacuum in Jehoiada's mentorship, in his advisory, and some men of Judah come. They pay homage to him, and they advise Joash, but not to walk in the ways of the Lord. But because Joash never addressed the issue of the heart, these men pulled him back into the ways of his father. Instead of restoring faithfulness, he restores the idols that God his father killed in the first place. He abandons the temple of the Lord, the temple that he dedicated so much time and effort to restore. He abandons it and turns to false gods. And this is the beginning, just the beginning of the fall of Joash. Everything he stood for in the beginning of his reign, he abandons just like that in an instant. And partly that is due to the fact that he lost his mentor. And I believe that Joash never really made the faith he was raised in his own, never personally invested in this. And once the man who was holding him to God's word was gone, he quickly departs from that and goes to what other people tell him to do. So he walks in the ways of Ahab. He becomes a rebel, a renegade, instead of a reformer. And we're going to see that he makes the problem much, much worse, even worse than his father before him. And yet, in all of this, God did not give up immediately on Joash. We read at the end of that section that God sent prophets to the people and to Joash to try and call him back, to tell him, hey, this was not how you were raised. This is not the right way. You saw what happened to your family before when they worshipped idols. You have to turn away from this before it's too late. And despite all of God's efforts to call Joash back, Joash closes his ears off. He won't pay any heed to the words of the prophets. And this comes to a climax in this next paragraph. And I think this is Joash's worst moment, worse than anything he's done to this point. We read of another prophet, the last prophet, who comes to try and call Joash and the people back. And it ends in tragedy. Picking up in verse 20 of chapter 24, it reads, "The Spirit of God enveloped Zechariah, son of Jehoiada, the priest. He stood above the people and said to them, 'This is what God says. Why are you transgressing the Lord's commands so that you do not prosper? Because you have abandoned the Lord, he has abandoned you.' But they conspired against him and stoned him at the king's command in the courtyard of the Lord's temple. King Joash didn't remember the kindness that Zechariah's father Jehoiada had extended to him, but killed his son. While he was dying, he said, 'May the Lord see and demand an account.'" We read of a prophet named Zechariah, not the Zechariah who wrote the book Zechariah, but a different prophet, a prophet who Jesus mentions and how the people who were supposed to be God's people were killing the prophets, starting with Abel all the way in Genesis to Zechariah at the horns of the altar. This is the Zechariah Jesus references. And this is just not any prophet, but we read that this is Jehoiada's son. Jehoiada, who raised Joash, who saved his life, protected him, mentored him, basically adopted him as his own, his uncle, his father figure, someone who did so much for him. It is his son who goes to try and give Joash one last chance to come back. But Joash ignores the words of Zechariah. And he doesn't just ignore the words, but he commands the people to drag Zechariah to the courtyard of the temple and stone him right there. Someone who he was probably raised with, maybe even saw as a brother, his cousin, his own flesh and blood, someone who was trying to help him. He had him stoned in the courtyard of the temple of the Lord, which he paid to rebuild. Joash had God's prophet stoned in God's house, and I don't see a bigger slap to the face to God. I don't see a bigger way to say, I don't care about what God has to say. And in the end, Zechariah's dying words are a call for vengeance against Joash. This is not a call for personal vengeance, though, but rather that God take action against this evil man who is not just responsible for himself here, but as king, he is also responsible for the spirituality of the people. Joash posed a danger not just to himself, but to the people of God. He commanded them to have God's prophet killed. He abandoned the temple of the Lord in order to serve idols and teach people to serve those idols instead of serving God. God's king was supposed to teach the people the law and to be faithful. And examples like Hezekiah and Josiah again. But Joash rather led the people away from God. The people themselves are still individually responsible for their own choices, but there's extra responsibility on God's leaders to lead the people to do the right thing. The people could still choose whether to follow that, but the king was extra responsible. And that's always how it is with God's leaders. And oftentimes, God's leaders and the kings and the prophets and the priests, we see many who don't follow God and they lead people astray. The prophets who are faithful often call out these leaders, how Israel and Judah have terrible shepherds who are constantly drawing the people away from God, and there is extra judgment because of that. Joash was not only ruining his own life, but he was pulling everyone away from being faithful to God, destroying the legacy of Jehoiada, who worked so hard to do the right thing. And the saddest statement I want to read again, just so it sits in our minds. King Joash didn't remember the kindness that Zechariah's father, Jehoiada, had extended to him, but killed his son. Joash forgot what he had known. He abandoned what was right. And because of this, it will cost his life. This is the fall of a king that should have been great. He had the potential to be a Hezekiah, to be a Josiah, but because he abandons everything he was taught, everything that was right, he ends up more like Ahab. And so Joash loses his life. God hears the cries of Zechariah in his dying breath. And we read of Joash's death in this next passage. At the turn of the year, an Armenian army attacked Joash. They entered Judah and Jerusalem and destroyed all the leaders of the people among them and sent all the plunder to the king of Damascus. Although the Armenian army came with only a few men, the Lord handed over a vast army to them because the people of Judah had abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, so they executed judgment on Joash. When the Arameans saw that Joash had many wounds, they left him. His servants conspired against him and killed him on his bed, because he had shed his blood of the sons of the priest Jehoiada. So he died, and they buried him in the city of David, but they did not bury him in the tomb of the kings. And those who conspired against him were Zabad, the son of the Ammonite woman, Shemaeth, and Jehozabad, son of the Moabite woman, Shimrith. The accounts concerning his sons, the many divine pronouncements about him, and the restoration of God's temple are recorded in the writings of the book of Kings. His son Amaziah became king in his place. So God sends an army to take out Joash, and Joash is left brutally wounded, not quite dead, and a couple men who are angry at Joash's actions finishes him off there. Because he had done terrible things against God's prophets, that he rejected God's words, these men finish the job. There's an even bigger slap to the face that these two men are what we might call Gentiles. One is an Ammonite, one is a Moabite, distant relatives of Judah and Israel. They're the ones who lived more faithfully than Joash and the rest of the people here. It's a tragic story, a tragedy of someone who should have known the right thing to do, but abandons everything. And there's a few lessons that I think we could take away from this. There are 3 lessons that I want to present tonight. Lesson 1, you must make your faith your own. You can't live out the faith of your parents or your friends or your mentors. But faith in God and following God is a personal commitment that each person must consider, think about, wrestle with, and choose for themselves. I grew up going to church my whole life in a group that had many young people, many people my age, and that was a blessing. I got to be raised with them, go to church with them, go to Bible class every Sunday morning. And there were kids there who would show up, who seemed to be faithful in all matters. They would go to Bible class every Sunday morning. They'd be there answering all the questions, saying all the right things, doing all the right things. But as they got older, as they moved out of the house, they quickly fell away, just like Joash did. Once his father figure was gone, once his mentor was gone, he lost his faithfulness and went after worldly things. This is an immense danger I've seen within the church. Being raised in the church is a blessed thing, but we also must emphasize while raising kids in the church that they need to consider all these things for themselves. Don't just be here because your parents want you here, but make this your own. Personalize this faith. This was a decision I had to make. I grew up, as I said, going to church, and I was the son of a preacher, so people had high expectations, and they said, "Oh, this kid must be great. You know, he's the son of a preacher who's the son of a preacher who's gone to church his whole life." But I wrestled with my faith. There's a long time where I was just going to church because my parents made me. And there's also a long time where I fell away and chased after worldly things. And it wasn't until I decided to personally convict myself in this, to personally devote myself to this, did my faith really stand a chance in the world. So if you want to have a faith that is lasting, it has to be your own faith. You can't live out other people's faith. The second lesson I want us to take from this is kind of building on a point Mike made this morning, but you must address sin at the heart of the issue. You must address the heart if you want to deal with the problem of sin. Some people might try to look as good on the outside as possible. Around people, they might try to make their actions look right, but on the inside, in their heart, they are corrupt and they have not really repented from their sins. They only look good on the outside. Just how Joash's temple looked good on the outside, but faithfulness was not restored. Jesus called out this kind of mindset in Matthew chapter 23. Jesus rebukes the spiritual leaders of Judea, of Galilee, men who should have known better, who should have been leading people in the right way, but they weren't. In Matthew chapter 23, we read this. In verse 13, it says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, for you don't go in, and you don't allow others to entering it to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to make one convert. When he becomes one, you make him twice as fit for hell as you are. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever takes an oath by the temple, it means nothing, but whoever takes an oath by the gold of the temple is bound by his oath. Blind fools! For which is greater, the gold of the temple or the gold of the temple or the temple that sanctified the gold? Also, whoever takes an oath by the altar, it means nothing, but whoever takes an oath by the gift that is on it is bound by his oath. Blind people, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? Therefore, the one who takes an oath by the altar takes an oath by it, by everything on it. The one who takes an oath by the temple takes an oath on it, and by him who dwells in it. And the one who takes an oath by heaven takes an oath by God's throne, by him who sits on it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You pay a tenth of mint, dill, and cumin, and yet you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These things should have been done without neglecting the others. Blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but gulp down a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisees, first clean the inside of the cup, so that the outside of it may also be clean. Last one I'll read here. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which appear beautiful on the outside, but inside are full of the bones of the dead, of every kind of impurity. In the same way, on the outside, you seem righteous to people, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. The spiritual leaders of Jesus' day, the men who were symbols of righteousness, who should have stood for what was right, the ones who taught the people what was right, on the inside, they were corrupt, they were evil, they were greedy. They ignored the weightier matters of the law, but only did things that made them look righteous. If we want to be a true follower of God, we can't just have the outside of our vessel clean. We can't just look good on the outside, but we need to clean the inside. Because it's out of the heart our true actions and intentions come from. If our heart is not set on the right path, our actions will end up evil in the end. That's what happens with Joash. He never cleaned out the inside of the cup for himself or for the people around him, and so they quickly fell back into idolatry. And this is the message that Jesus presents on the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is a reflection for us to look at our hearts, see, are we dirty or clean? What can we do to fix the issue? You must look at the heart, reflect on it, and have your heart seek after the things of God. The third and last lesson I want us to take away from this, a lesson that I hope has been very apparent in everything I've said this morning, is be wary of influence. There's two parts to this. Be wary of your influence on others. For you might not always see it or know it, but your actions, your words, your lifestyle influences the people around you, whether for good or bad. Jesus calls us to be lights of the world. That's why I had that song sung earlier. We are called to be an influence in the world for good, so that the world can see us striving to follow God, live after God, and be influenced for good in that. As a goal each and every one of us should have when going out. But if we go out into the world and we're dirty on the inside still, and we're living after the world instead of after the will of God, and we're calling ourselves Christians but living like the rest of the world, that is an influence on people as well. But it's not an influence for good. It pushes people away. It gives a false impression of what Christians are and what they stand for. And instead of bringing people to God, you take them away from God, just like Joash did. Instead of leading the people to faithfulness, Joash led them to idolatry, to sin, to murder. We must be wary of the influence we have in the world because we have some responsibility for others. Also, be wary of the influence that other people have on you. We saw what the worst influence can do to a person. We also saw what the best influence can do to a person. Jehoiada raised Joash to be good, to follow after God's will. And for a while, he was successful. But evil men crept in. Their evil influence took over. Athaliah, the evil queen, influenced her son to do evil. We must be wary of influences in the world. We are part of a great community here of faithful Christians who care about each other. And we can learn from their actions and from their words to be better every day. We're a group of imperfect people trying to be better, and we could all influence each other for good. That is why we have the church. But I've seen so many people come to church on Sunday and then go out into the world, be influenced by the world, and abandon God, abandon his people. Be careful of who you allow to influence you. But remember this: if you have strayed away, if you have left God, done what was evil, maybe you were faithful at one point and abandoned that faith, God has not given up on you yet. God didn't give up on Joash. He made attempts to bring Joash back, and God wants to bring you back. He's already done the greatest thing to show that by sending Jesus, his son, to die so that we can be rescued as Joash was rescued from his fate, so that we can have a restored relationship with him, to learn about him, learn about his word, and to serve him faithfully. God has not given up on you. If you are still here today, if you're still sitting here, God is here wanting you to come back. So don't forget these things. Don't be like Joash and forget the good things that God has done for you. And if you are ready to dedicate your life to this, if you haven't dedicated your life to this already and you want to be a part of this, you want to experience that love of God, you want to be a part of this community and be restored to God and be washed of your sins, you could be baptized today. Or if you are like Joash and you've left that faith, but you want to come back, God is waiting with open arms, and we could help you in any way. So if there's anything we could do for you, anything we can help you with or pray about, please let us know as we stand and sing.